each and every week we are getting closer and closer to the fantasy football playoffs. And what you are going to need is high upside players that could absolutely break out in the second half of the season. So today I'm bringing you 10 mustache players to have at the end of your bench that can be absolutely league winning. If you like fantasy football, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button as we're on the way to 3,000 subscribers over here on the new 4for4 Fantasy Football YouTube channel. We started off with stash number 1, and it is going to be Brian Robinson for the San Francisco 49ers, who over on Sleeper is 37% rostered. And yes, we have seen double-digit fantasy points over the last 2 weeks from Mr. B-Rob. Of course, he was traded for a 6th-round pick from the Commanders to the 49ers earlier this season. And yes, Brian Robinson is not going to be a league winner unless something happens to Christian McCaffrey. But if something were to happen to Christian McCaffrey, Brian Robinson would be a top 20, if not a top 17 back rest of season. And so that is ultimate level game winning upside that you can have on your bench, that if something were to happen, I don't care if you own CMC or not, Brian Robinson needs to be owned and rostered on your team, especially with what we're seeing in this running back landscape. Like if you're a Kenneth Walker owner, if you're a Zach Charbonnet owner, maybe you're struggling at that RB3, RB2 spot, having a guy like a B-Rob who potentially has high-end RB2, if not low-end RB1 upside, is somebody that I want to be stashing on each and every one of my fantasy teams if I have the space. And I know a lot of you say, hey, Caleb, I don't have the space, with these buys, with some of these injuries. And so I understand we're trying to give you players in each and every league size that could be available for you. So we'll keep going on to stash number 2, and it's going to be Blake Corum for the Rams. And Blake Corum is only 21% rostered, even though he is getting more and more snap share for the Rams. The last 2 weeks, a 28 and a 39% snap share. Now it only came to 5.8 and 5.6 fantasy points in full PPR. So I hear you. He is not somebody that you're throwing in at your flex spot starting comfortably, but he is continuing to carve out more and more of a role. They've kind of seen Kyren Williams as being super productive and a lot more efficient with him not having a 75% snap share. So by giving Blake Corum some of those carries, we're seeing some drives where Blake Corum's the only running back out there on the field. And I'm not saying anything for Kyren Williams because, trust me, guys, on some of my most important teams, I have Kyren Williams. But the same exact thing with B-Rob, having a guy, a high-priority handcuff like Blake Corum, whether I have Kyren Williams or not, we've seen how this Rams offense continues to play week in and week out. And so I want to take Blake Corum, who's only 21% rostered. He needs to be rostered. So Brian Robinson, Blake Corum, target those two guys, especially if you need running back help, because there is high-end potential. And let's be clear, you don't want to have to wait until these guys, something happens to their starter, and then you have to drop all your fab or your number 1 waiver wire priority. Make sure that you just have them on the end of your bench because you're going to feel a lot better about it later on this season. Now, my third stash in this video, it's going to be Bhayshul Tuten for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And I think anybody would have said after their bye, you would have expected a little bit better things for Bhayshul Tuten. In that week 9 game after the bye, he did put up 9.6 fantasy points on a 25% snap share. Now, he did find the end zone in that game. And then in week 10 versus Houston, only put up 2 fantasy points, even though he had very similar snap share, 27% snap share, only 4 carries for 5 yards. And then, of course, had 2 targets for 1 reception. So it wasn't a great day in week 10. But let's not forget, Bhayshul Tuten was brought in to have and be like James Gladstone's running back. He talked about in his early on interview that, hey, I want to go get Bhayshul Tuten. I think he could be perfect for the scheme that I want to be building in the front office. And so in the matchups coming up, we got the Chargers this week, Arizona week 12, Tennessee in week 13, Indy in week 14, and then the Jets in week 15. This is an absolute great stretch for both Travis Etienne and Bhayshul Tuten. And not that I'm like thinking anything's going to necessarily happen to Travis Etienne. That would be kind of the way that Bhayshul Tuten would have to kind of succeed. But I do think Bhayshul Tuten has some standalone value because I believe they're just going to want to get him more and more involved. And we've seen historically Travis Etienne start to slow down towards the end of the season. So definitely make sure you're targeting Bhayshul Tuten, Blake Corum, and Brian Robinson. Those are my top 3 mustache candidates heading into Week 11 fantasy football. Now moving on to stash number 4. This is going to be Sean Tucker for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who is 27% rostered, who, if you've been watching these games, Sean Tucker looks a lot more explosive than Rachaad White. When we're looking at him in Week 10 versus New England, he came up with 6 fantasy points. He had a 32% snap share, 9 carries for 53 yards, which is great, and then had 2 targets for 1 reception. Rachaad White does not look explosive. I think Sean Tucker is going to get more and more of this work. The part that we have to highlight is Bucky Irving. What is happening with Bucky Irving? Because, of course, there's only value if Bucky Irving continues to remain out. And so that is something that you do have to monitor. That's why I prefer Tuten, Blake Corum, Brian Robinson Jr., because it's a little bit more clear. All it takes is really one circumstance, one injury for them to get any sort of run. Whereas Sean Tucker, you're kind of like, if Bucky Irving comes back, is he going to be just relegated back to the bench to riding the pine, which could 100% be happening. But seeing, of course, 9 carries for 53 yards for 5.89 yards per carry, super efficient numbers versus a very stout New England run attack. Buffalo, Rams, Arizona the next 3 weeks. I feel very comfortable, feel very confident with Sean Tucker if you need to pick him up. I prefer the other guys ahead of him, but he is my 4th overall stash here. He's 27% roster on Sleeper, so definitely be making a shot on Sean Tucker if you need some rolls. And potentially if you own Rachaad White and Bucky Irving, like adding Sean Tucker, just locking down that backfield could be super helpful. Now, my 5th overall stash, and this is going to be my last running back, and this is going to be Emari Demercado for the Arizona Cardinals. And yes, did this the same Emari Demercado that dropped the ball before landing in the end zone when it was his week versus both Tennessee and the Colts? Yes, that is the same Emari Demercado. But the thing that I want to highlight here is we've seen him this last week versus Seattle. He was the most explosive back. He played 42% of the snaps, but he did have 13.4 fantasy points, 4 carries for 64 yards, 16 average yards per carry, and then he did have 4 targets for 3 receptions, 10 yards. If they're going to have Jacoby Brissett back there, there is going to be value in these running backs catching passes in being PPR merchants. Now, the third part that we got to talk about is Trey Benson coming off of IR. How long or what is Trey Benson going to look like? I don't know, but I think Emari Demercado is still going to be at least the RB2 at worst, if not potentially, if Trey Benson doesn't look that good, they could continue riding Emari Demercado. I think he's kind of gotten the coaches like forgiveness from dropping that absolutely terrible, like he was the reason they lost the game because he dropped the ball before going in the end zone. So Emari Demercado is there. Of course, I prefer some of the running backs ahead of time, but like I said, he is 47% roster, so he's actually rostered at like more than some of these other guys on Sleeper, which to me doesn't make any sense because I think those other, I guess this week, they're assuming maybe there's some flex upside there, but I think rest of the season, I still prefer Brian Robinson and Blake Corum over a guy like an Emari Demercado. Now, move on to some wide receivers, and we'll give you 2 different wide receivers that you need to be stashing. Number 1 is going to be Luther Burden for the Chicago Bears. When we're talking through Luther Burden as a whole, yes, he's only 18% rostered. We've only seen him get an eclipse double-digit fantasy points 1 time this whole season. But the biggest news for Mr. Luther Burden is after the bye week, we have seen 23, 28, 17. He was injured in week 9, but then in week 10, he came up with a 49% snap share. 3 targets, 3 receptions, 51 yards. Listen, Luther Burden deserves more opportunities. He deserves more opportunities than Zacchaeus, in my humble opinion, and he's going to continue to ascend rest of season. If we're talking about Luther Burden being the next Amon-Ra St. Brown, then 100% you need to be targeting and adding him on the end of your bench. Now, I understand this. We saw Rome get 0 points 2 weeks ago. It hasn't been like the super reliable Chicago Bears offense where there's a lot of mouths to feed between DeAndre Swift, Kyle Monungai. We talked through the wide receivers, DJ Moore, Rome Odunze, Luther Burden, Zacchaeus. You then also add in Colston Leveland. Like, I understand week to week, it could be an absolute nightmare. But if for some reason Luther Burden were to ascend, an injury were to happen to either Rome or DJ Moore, we're talking about Luther Burden to the absolute moon. If Luther Burden can anytime this season get over a 65% snap share, we're talking about a high-end wide receiver 3 to low-end wide receiver 2 with high wide receiver 1 spike weeks. Luther Burden is a guy that I want to be stashing, and I guess I'm just all in on. Go get some Luther Burden. Next guy is going to be Devaughn Vele for the New Orleans Saints. He caught 1 pass in week 10. He is only 3% rostered, but if you need some wide receiver help, this Saints team, they traded away Rashid Shaheed. And Vele, they gave out a ridiculous pick for earlier on this season. And so I want to be targeting him because he's the clear wide receiver 2. I'm not really scared about Brandon Cooks. And then Jawan Johnson's going to kind of get his week in and week out. But we're looking at the matchups coming down the pike. Of course, in week 11, he is on bye. So if you potentially want to wait, you could probably wait for waivers until week 12. But Atlanta, Miami, Tampa Bay, Carolina, a lot of heavy pass matching options, but also the second piece of going up against some good passing matchups is the fact that they do have to target him, and they're going to be playing from behind. And so Devaughn Vele is a guy that I would definitely be targeting. I prefer Luther Burden. To be completely honest, ladies and gentlemen, like the wide receiver stashes, it's hard because you almost have to wait for them to break out. Like in previous weeks, I've talked about like a Jaden Reed. Definitely go see if Jaden Reed or Brandon Ayuk's out there, like 2 injured guys that maybe if they come back could provide some value. But in a deeper stash, Luther Burden, Devaughn Vele would be some guys. Now, I always like to give you a tight end stash as well. Mr. Three-Legged Greg Dulcich makes an appearance here in this video. And if anybody plays Dynasty or remembers, when Greg Dulcich was a rookie-level tight end, there was talks about him being absolutely elite. And then that fell off in year 2. And now we're talking about a player in year 3 with the Miami Dolphins who literally has not played the whole entire season, but then the last 2 weeks, 9.9 fantasy points versus Baltimore and then 3.2 versus Buffalo. But this is an offense with no Darren Waller and no Tyreek Hill. So we're talking about Jalen Waddle, Malik Washington, and Greg Dulcich being the main receiving core for Tua Tagovailoa. Now, going up against Washington this week, it's going to be a little bit of a hit or miss matchup because, of course, Marcus Mariota can't necessarily throw the ball all that well. And the Washington Commanders are super beat up. So it probably is going to be a good game script day for Greg Dulcich with some play action from Devon Achane to Greg Dulcich, as well as them just maybe having to throw the ball. And so I think there's some really great opportunities. He's probably slotted in for anywhere between 4 to 6 targets a game, which if he catches most of those could put him at least, 50 yards and potentially a touchdown. And so I like Mr. Three-Legged Greg Dulcich. If you guys don't know, that is my nickname for him. And that has been his nickname since his rookie season. If you just assume there's a reason he's called Mr. Three-Legged Greg Dulcich. But I don't know if there's photo evidence, but there's a ton of stories. So go look it up. But anyway, Greg Dulcich absolutely must be added as a tight end because I think he definitely has top 20 upside tight end rest of the season. So if you're playing like in a double tight end format or you're super desperate, especially with these buys or with some of these injuries, definitely go get Greg Dulcich. Now, we always like to provide 2 like streaming defenses to kind of keep in mind because some of you just prefer to hold 2 defenses at all times, and that's fine. The Raiders would be one defense that I would be looking to, of course, stash. Now, this week they're going up against Dallas in week 11, so definitely don't play them if you grab them off of waivers. They're only 3% roster, but in week 12 they're going up against Cleveland. That is a juicy matchup. Anybody going up against Cleveland Browns at this point, Dylan Gabriel can't seem to throw the ball. They looked a little more efficient last week, so maybe this might be a bad call if they kind of take the next step here in week 11. But I'm still very confident that Mason Crosby and the boys will be able to get after Dylan Gabriel. Maybe it'll be Shedeur Sanders by then, but Las Vegas, I like that matchup versus Cleveland. And then, of course, the next defense is going to be the Jacksonville Jaguars, who in week 12 are going up against Arizona, and then in week 13 are going up against Tennessee. So I think it's going to be 2 good matchups of the Jacksonville Jaguars back-to-back, where if you grab them, you could play them for 2 weeks in a row. There's not many defenses rest of season that you're going to actually be able to talk about that for. They are 31% roster, so they're a little bit more rostered than the Las Vegas Raiders, but I do still think they are a good enough defense that you're going to want to add, especially as we kind of talk through the rest of the season rankings and getting some of these options. But if you like fantasy football, if you like winning, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. We absolutely appreciate each and every one of you for tuning into this video. We're going to be back. We're here all season. We're answering all your start sit questions. So I want you here into the community we're building. So I appreciate you guys, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.